and it's a very exciting time for us here to have Dan Pink joining us. Many of you may be familiar with Dan and the work that he's done. He's the author of 4 provocative books about the changing world of work, including the New York Times bestseller, A Whole New Mind and Drive, which is the book we're going to talk about today and the topic of today's discussion. Dan lives in Washington with his wife and their 3 children, and he has had some interesting jobs. He's had some real jobs, so that's important to note, other than these great work that he does as an author and as a frequent writer and master blog writer. And he has worked, his last real job was in the White House, where he served from 1995 to 1997 as the chief speechwriter to Vice President Al Gore. He also worked as an aide to U.S. Labor Secretary Robert Reich and in other positions in politics and government. So it is our great pleasure to have Dan here today. And before we get started and have Dan take us through his material and talk with us, we thought it would be really helpful to just get a sense of who's in the audience today in terms of, we know that many of you are health promotion professionals, but just wanted to get a sense of where, what type of work settings you're in. So Kelly, if you wouldn't mind launching our poll for us so that we can have a sense of who's in our audience. So if you take a moment and answer the question, which option best describes your role in health promotion? So there's 5 options there that we'd like to have you select from. So while that polling is in progress, we will take just a few moments to be able to get those responses, and then we'll take a look at the results, and then we will begin our presentation. So we've got a few more. Let's take another moment or two there. And then, Kelly, if you wouldn't mind giving us the results of that poll. So most of you are working within the field of worksite health promotion within a company or organization. So that would be 44% of you. Some of you are product or service providers within the worksite health promotion field at 15%. Some clinical folks here, so 3% in clinical settings, and 15% in government, and then 23% in other. Sorry, the other couldn't be more specific, and we only could have 5 options, so 23% in other. So thanks. That gives us a sense of who's here today and the types of things you might be interested in from this topic. So with that, Dan, we'll turn it over to you and take us through what is it that motivates us.
All right. Thank you, Mari. Thanks to all the folks who are taking time on a Friday afternoon to listen in or Skype in or go to webinar in, however you're getting in here. Thanks for your time. What I want to do is talk a little bit about motivation. And in some ways, Mari, I have as many questions, probably more questions than I have answers. Most of the work that research that I've done is in the field of what motivates people at work to do a good job at work, to perform well at work. I think that kind of research actually yields some very, very interesting guesses and very interesting ideas about how to promote healthy behavior. But you know, I actually have some questions to the experts out there about that sort of thing. So what I want to do here in our time is give a kind of big overview of what some of this research shows, particularly as it relates to the world of work, and then make a few flicks at what its application might be to health promotion. So, and I want to start out with a sort of setting the context here. A lot of times when we talk about motivation, we think of it as exhortation, and we think that motivating people is about, believe in yourself, or smile before you walk into the room to trigger a positive attitude and those kinds of things. And that's not quite right. I'm taking a very different perspective on motivation. That's the perspective of science. It turns out that over the last 50 years, a group of social scientists all over the world have taken a very hard-headed, very rigorous look at what really motivates people, as I said, especially what motivates people at work. They've done laboratory experiments, field studies that give us a really rigorous sense of when are people motivated, and what are the elements of enduring motivation. I'm going to tell you a little bit about that science. Now, I don't want to torture you on a Friday afternoon with too much science. So what I want to do is show you one study here that we can think of as in some ways the big bang of this line of research. It took place 50 years ago, 1962, by a guy named Sam Glucksberg, who's now at Princeton University. And this experiment, I think, in many ways is the sort of embodies what scientists have found out for the last 50 years. And so let me explain it to you. It involves So I want to tell you about the thing called the candle problem. The candle problem is a very famous experiment in technique, at least, in social psychology. And here's how it works. So I would bring in someone like, say I bring in you, Maury, and I give you these items. I give you a candle, some matches, and some thumbtacks. And I say to you, your job is to fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table.
All right, now I'm not seeing your screen, so if I should be seeing those pictures.
Yeah, you should be seeing it.
Okay, try that again.
All right, hold on
there
a second
we go.
here.
I got it now, and then try going back to play.
How about this? Do you see it now?
No, I'm getting a black screen. Let's just work on that. Kelly, are you seeing a black screen there too?
I am seeing a black screen.
Maybe it's just me.
No, it's not you. It is a black screen.
But you're seeing this?
I'm seeing that.
Yeah, I'm seeing that.
Click on slide 3 and show it. Maybe it's just that slide.
Well, I don't want to do slide 3. How about this one?
Yeah. Okay. Yep, I
Are
see
you seeing
that one.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
All right, we'll just stick with this. How about that?
Okay.
We'll make it work.
That works.
Okay, so here's what we have going on here. We have the candle problem. So I bring in Maury. I give you here. Can you see my cursor moving there?
I can.
Okay, here we go. So I give you a candle. I give you some thumbtacks, and I give you some matches. And I say to you, Maury, your job is to fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. Attach the candle to the wall, fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. Now, it's actually a very hard problem to solve looking at pictures, but most people who and people very rarely come up with a solution right away. So people will often begin by trying to thumbtack the candle directly into the wall, which is a bad idea, doesn't work. Some people will try lighting the matches and melting the side of the candle, and then using that stickiness to adhere the candle to the wall. That doesn't work either. But eventually most people do come up with a solution. Again, it's because it's hard to solve with pictures, but if you have the materials in front of you, the vast majority of people do figure out how to fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. And they often do it within 10 or 11. They usually do it within 10 or 11 minutes. They end up coming up with a solution to this problem. And the solution you can see here. That's how you fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. The key is to overcome what psychologists call social psychologists call functional fixedness. Functional fixedness. You look at that box initially and you see it only as a receptacle for the tacks. Okay, so we go back here, you look at that box, you say, hey, it's just a receptacle for the tacks. But as you play around with it, as you get frustrated, as you try new approaches, you say, wait a second, this box can have a second function. It can be a platform for the candle. It can be a platform for the candle. And so this technique has been used for many, many years to test the conditions under which people are able to do this kind of breakthrough thinking, this kind of breakthrough problem solving, which is the sort of problem solving and thinking style that we want inside of organizations. And we know from, the survey that the vast majority, we have 44% are working inside of companies, at least 44% are working inside of companies. What was it, another 15 or so percent were working inside of government. So these are the kinds of things in organizations, sorts of ways of thinking we want people to be able to pull off. We want them to be able to solve complex problems, think in fresh, creative, breakthrough ways. And so this is used to test the conditions under which people are able to do that. So for instance, just to give you one quick example from some research last year, it turns out that people who have lived in more than one country, people who have lived in more than one country, not visited but lived, typically solve this problem faster than people who have lived in only one country. It doesn't really matter what the countries are, but it's that experience of living in a new place gives you fresh eyes, gives you the ability to see things in a more novel way. So This experiment was used, okay, we're talking about motivation. How do we motivate people? How do we motivate people to solve these kinds of problems? How do we motivate people to do these kinds of complex tasks? And in 1962, Sam Glucksberg had an idea. Well, what we can do is we can incentivize people to solve these kinds of problems. And so he set up this really interesting experiment. What he did is he got a whole bunch of participants, and he divided them into two groups. The first group he treated like this. He brought them in one by one. We'll call it Group A. Group A, he brought in one by one, and he gave them the candle problem, which we see back here. Right? We gave him this problem. We gave him the candle, the matches, and some thumbtacks. He said, here's the candle problem. Fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. I'm going to be here in the room with you as you solve this problem. I'm going to have a stopwatch, and I'm going to time you. I'm going to see how long it typically takes someone to solve this kind of problem. I want to time you, to record your times, and use it to establish averages or norms for how long it usually takes someone to solve this sort of problem. Okay, that's how we treated Group A. We time their results and use their times to establish the averages for how this problem works. The second group he treated differently. Group B he treated differently. He brought them in one by one and said, here's the candle problem, candles, matches, thumbtacks. Fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. Now I'm going to time you to see how quickly you do this. And the goal, of course, is to get as fast a time as possible, to solve it as quickly as possible. But in order to help you out, I'm going to offer you some incentives. I'm going to offer you some incentives to give you the motivation to solve these problems, this kind of problem, faster and more elegantly. And so he said to them, if you are among the top 20%, if you're the 20% fastest times of all the people we're testing here today, you get $5. Now, this was 1962, so that's equivalent to $35 today. Okay, so think about it this way. So I bring you in and say, hey, if you're one of the top performers, if you're in the 80th percentile and above, you get $35. But it gets even better than that, because if you're number one, if you're the fastest of everybody we're testing here today, you get, in today's dollars, $250. Okay, so that's how we treat the second group. If they're in the 80th percentile and above, they get $35. If they're the fastest of everybody, they get $250. And the idea here is to see, how much are these motivators going to improve performance? Obviously, we know. I mean, they're going to have some kind of positive effect. They're going to help people a little bit. We know that if you reward behavior, you get more of it. You punish it, you get less of it. So here's this incentive designed to get people to think faster, think more creatively. And the question is, how much of an effect is it really going to have? That is, how much faster will people in that second group solve this problem? How much faster will people in that second group solve this problem compared to the first group that lacks the incentives? And so he does the experiment, he crunches the numbers, and it turned out there was a pretty significant difference. That the second group, the group with the incentives, solved the problem, on average, about 3.5 minutes slower. Now, that's kind of freaky, right? I mean, again, you have this incentive designed to accelerate thinking, sharpen creativity, and it does the exact opposite. It dulls thinking, seems to dull thinking, slow creativity. So Sam Glucksberg says, this is kind of weird. This is not what I expected. This is not how motivation is supposed to work. Let me try it. What's going on here? Let me try this again. So what he did is he presented the problem differently. He got a whole new group of people, and he presented the problem like this. He gave people candle, thumbtacks, matches, and the box, and he said, fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. Fix the candle to the wall so the wax doesn't drip onto the table. The exact same assignment. And the conditions were the same. He obviously had got new groups of, new participants, but he treated them exactly the same. The first group, he said, solve the problem. I'm going to time you and use your time for averages, norms, for how long it typically takes someone to solve a problem like this. The second group, he said, I'm going to offer you some incentives. If you're in the top 20%, you get $35 in today's dollars. If you're number one, if you're the fastest of everybody, you get $250. Okay, same exact conditions, just the presentation of the problem was different. And here's what he found out, that this time, the group with the incentives solved the problem a lot faster. So when the problem was like this, the group with the incentive solved it faster. When the problem was like this, the group without the incentive solved it faster. And this is, as I mentioned, kind of the big bang of a lot of this research. And here's what he found out, and here's what social psychologists and economists even have been finding out for essentially the last 50 years. And I think this goes to the nature of work inside the organizations that are represented here. But I also think, as we'll get to in a moment, and I hope we get to in far greater detail and depth in the questions and answers, I think this offers some hints about health promotion. Here's what, again, I'm going to give you 50 years of science in a minute here. So 50 years of science about what really motivates people. What 50 years of science. Here's what the 50 years of science says. There's a kind of motivator that we use in organizations, whether we use them with employees in their performance or whether we use them in wellness programs. It's what I call an if-then reward, an if-then reward, as in, if, Maury, you do this, then you get that. If you do this, then you get that. Okay, it's a contingency, and we use those kinds of rewards all the time. In our offices, in terms of day-to-day work, we use them certainly in wellness programs. We use them with our kids. We use them in schools. If-then rewards. If you do this, then you get that. It turns out that 50 years of science tells us this, that those if-then rewards work pretty well for tasks that are simple, mechanical, what psychologists call algorithmic, where you're following a set of rules, reaching a logical conclusion, marching step by step by step down a path to an obvious outcome. That for that kind of work, simple, mechanical, algorithmic, it's things like turning the same screw the same way on an assembly line, adding up columns of figures in a white-collar office, stuffing envelopes, that kind of work, straightforward recipe. I like to think of it as recipe works. All you're doing is following a recipe. You're marching down the list, doing what you're supposed to do. For that kind of work, if-then motivators are pretty effective. They really are. They get us to focus. Rewards of all kind get our attention. That's how we're wired. They get our attention. And when you offer somebody an if-then reward, it gets her attention, but in a very focused way. In a very focused way. Okay, great. If there's a reward out there, what can I do? And that kind of framework, that sort of looking at a problem very narrowly, is very effective when the task is simple, when it's straightforward, when it is, another good word, my favorite word is routine, when it's routine, okay, when it's mechanical, when it's routine. For routine work, those kinds of motivators work really well. They get you to block out distractions, barrel straight ahead. Okay? But as we saw, as Sam Glucksberg first started finding out, when that's the example of when the tasks are out of the box, when there is not a functional fix in this problem, when the answer is obvious. The group with the incentive solved the problem faster when the problem was easier, when it was simple, when it was an algorithmic task. But 50 years of science tells us also this, that when you ask people to do more complicated work, more creative work, more conceptual work, work where the answer isn't obvious, work where you're coming up with a novel solution, work where you're iterating something that the world has never seen before, things that involve great amounts of creativity and complexity, those kinds of if-then motivators just don't work very well. Sometimes they backfire and impair performance, but a lot of the time they just don't do any good. They're just zeros. And so this is a very, very sturdy finding in social science. It's actually uncontroversial in the world of social science. Again, to repeat myself, if-then rewards, great for simple, not great for complex. Great for mechanical, algorithmic kinds of tasks, not so great for creative, heuristic sorts of tasks. It's totally uncontroversial. And here's why this ought to alarm us, both in terms of day-to-day work and also in terms of health promotion. A lot of times when we see these kinds of motivators fail in our organizations, we can think of these as a class of motivators, carrot and stick motivators. When we see these kinds of if-then carrot and stick motivators fail inside of organizations, when we see them demonstrably flop before our very eyes, many times our response isn't to say, oh man, those carrot and stick motivators failed again, maybe we should try something different. Instead, our response is to say, man, those carrot and stick motivators failed again, I guess we need a lot more carrots, I guess we need a lot more sticks. If these carrots and sticks aren't promoting wellness, if they're not encouraging people into healthy behaviors, I guess that means we got to offer bigger rewards. I guess that means we have to offer sharper punishments. And what it's doing in many cases, not all, is it's taking us down a fundamentally misguided road. That in many cases we're that instead of doing something different, when we see something fail, instead of taking a different approach, we say, oh, it failed. What this means is that I'm not doing what I'm doing intensely enough. So let me continue to do what turns out to be the wrong thing, just more intensely. And so that ought to alarm us. The other thing is, if the people on this webinar are thinking about their own organizations or thinking about their own day-to-day work, most of the problems that we're dealing with at work are non-routine. The routine problems are the easier ones. But most of what people are doing in day-to-day on the job is non-routine work, work that requires judgment, discretion, complexity, creativity. And what we have essentially in our workplaces, and I'm talking about workplaces as a place to do work, if you, I mean, if you forgive that insipid comment, but not necessarily as places to promote health, but what workplaces as places where work gets done. Most people are doing non-routine kind of work, and yet our motivators are the kind of motivators we typically would use for routine work. And so what we have is we have a set of motivators that are very good for 19th century work and to some extent 20th century work, but they just don't function very well for 21st century work that we have that they're trying to do something that they're not designed to do. And so I think this is a pretty significant problem, that we've essentially over-relied on carrots and sticks, especially in our organizations. Doesn't mean that they're bad all the time, not at all. It means that you got to use them where they work and not use them where they don't work. So let's turn the corner here very quickly and talk about what does work. Okay, what does lead to enduring motivation to help people solve these complicated, more conceptual kinds of tasks? And I would think, and it'll be interesting, I think health behavior is a mix of routine and non-routine. But let's talk about, when you talk about in the workplace, what motivates people to do these sorts of things? It turns out that it's much more intrinsic factors than extrinsic factors, but we have to begin here. The key is to pay people enough. Pay people enough. Okay, this idea that if you want to motivate your workforce, and intrinsic motivators are powerful motivators, that you can basically use those and not pay people well is a joke. It's just not empirically true. Money matters. Money matters a lot in promoting particularly performance inside of organization. Now we can talk about its role in health promotion, but money matters a lot in organizational performance and in motivating people at work. Okay, so that's just, that is an inexorable fact, but it doesn't matter in quite the way that we think. Here's the story. People are exquisitely attuned to the norm of fairness. Okay, so if you violate the norm of fairness, you're toast. So that if you have two people doing comparable work and you're paying one more than the other and the other finds out, profoundly demotivating. If you're, Mario, working at one kind of organization, doing certain kind of work, same level of contribution, and someone else is at a similarly situated institution doing similar kinds of work but getting paid a lot more, profoundly demotivating for you. So you got to pay people enough. I think there's an argument, there's actually a very powerful argument in the economics literature about paying people a little more than enough. Essentially what we're thinking here is what is the role of money in motivation? And the role of money in motivation is a little bit paradoxical. It's important, especially at work. It's really important. But the best use of money is to pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table. Pay people enough so they're not thinking about money, they're thinking about the work. And we have this misguided notion that if we raise the salience of money, and this is true at work, it's true for certain kinds of health behaviors, if we raise the salience of money, that will work better. That's a good solution. But the truth is that raising the salience of money just gets people to think about money. And so what you want to do, especially in the workplace, is you want to raise the salience of the work itself. And one way to do that is reduce the salience of money so that people aren't focused on the money, they're focused on the work. So pay people enough to take the issue of money off the table. Once you do that, it turns out there are three big factors in enduring motivation, particularly for these more complicated, creative, and conceptual tasks. They are autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Autonomy, mastery, and purpose. Now, I use that word enduring advisedly because, Mario and I were talking a little bit before we opened up to all the folks, the tens of millions of people from around the world who are listening in on this. And one of the things that Mario mentioned, using these kinds of things for short-term behaviors, these kinds of if-then motivators actually do kind of work in the short term. That's pretty clear. So if you think about it, again, I'm thinking about it in terms of the workplace context. If you're a sales manager and you want to hit your numbers this month, you're worried about, here it is, the month closes in 13 days and you're worried about not hitting your numbers this month, and you want to hit your numbers, you should offer your sales team a huge honking bonus for closing deals by June 30th. All right, just as huge a bonus as you can muster for closing deals by June 30th. You'll hit your numbers. you'll get a result. Now, you might burn your best customers in the process. You might have people pull in orders from later in the year, but people will respond to that. So these if-then motivators can be quote unquote effective in the short run. They can, but they can be effective in the short run in the way that, let's say that I was a little bit, didn't feel a lot of vitality. Okay, I could have 6 cups of coffee and 3 Snickers bars, and I'd be pretty hopped up. Okay, that would work in the short term on my vitality problem, but it's not long-term nutrition. And so for enduring motivation, these 3 factors matter most. So what I want to do is just go over them very, very briefly, and then show you a kind of an interesting sort of, forgive me, it's a flow chart of how to make decisions about when to apply these kinds of rewards. And then we'll take a bunch of questions focused much more specifically on health. So autonomy. Autonomy is our desire to direct our own lives, to have some sovereignty over what we do, how we do it. And it turns out that if you really want people to be engaged in what they're doing, that the classic form of management doesn't work. Management is largely about control. It's about getting compliance. And human beings don't engage by being managed. The only way that human beings engage is if they get there under their own steam. And that calls for sometimes, rather sturdy amounts of autonomy. I want to come back to this idea of engagement too, because we want people to be engaged in their health behaviors too. Human beings don't engage by being controlled. They don't engage by being managed. They will comply. Okay? You can control people into compliance, okay, but you can't control them into true engagement. The only way people engage is if they're able to do it on their own. And so what you're seeing right now in the workplace are companies doing, we can talk about this in Q&A, companies doing some rather extraordinary things to give people a little bit more autonomy over what they do, how they do it, who they do it with, and when they do it. Everything from letting people pick their colleagues for, on teams, everything from giving people 10% of their time to work on whatever they want, going to something called a results-only work environment where people don't have schedules. They don't have to be in the office at a certain time or any time. They just have to get their work done. Things like companies eliminating vacation policy and essentially saying to people, take as much vacation as you want whenever you want it. We're not going to monitor that kind of thing. You're fully autonomous in dealing with that. And so what we're seeing is that, that management is how you get compliance. But if you want engagement, then what you need is self-direction, and that requires greater autonomy. That's number one. Number two, mastery. Mastery is our desire to get better at stuff. We like to get better at stuff because we like to get better at stuff. It's inherently satisfying. And so this is one of the most, we know that in the day-to-day work, there's some interesting research at Harvard Business School that shows that the single most motivating thing day-to-day at work is making progress. And people do things because they like making progress. They do things because they get better at them, even in the absence of any kind of external reward. That making progress is self-reinforcing in many ways. So if you make progress one day, you're more likely to you're more motivated the next day, which means you're more likely to make progress. The problem is that the architecture of our firms, I don't mean the physical architecture, I just mean the overall total gestalt, the structure of our firms, is not quite right for allowing people to make progress, because progress depends very much on feedback. The only way you know whether you're making progress is if you get feedback on your performance. And I would argue that much of the world of work, much of the workplace is a feedback desert. You got these people, especially younger people, who are living in worlds of rich, robust, regular feedback, where they play a video game and they get a score. They press a button, something happens. They're just so rich, the worlds are rich in feedback, and then they get into a company and they get feedback on their work once a year in a performance review. That archaic, outdated, formal, stiff, kabuki theater approach to feedback. And so if we really want people to make progress, we have to think about ways to enrich the feedback environment. And there's some interesting examples of how organizations are doing that. And finally is this concept of purpose. And I think this is huge, especially in health promotion. It's not the only thing, but it's an essential thing. Human beings want to know why what they do matters. Human beings want to make a contribution. They want to have some context for things. And there's a lot of research, again, I can go into it in Q&A if folks are interested. There's a lot of research that shows that getting people to think about the purpose of what they're doing before they do it can have a huge boost to their performance. That is, if you get people saying, asking, okay, why am I doing this in the first place? What's the point of the exercise? That can boost performance. And a lot of times, when we're in charge of anything, when we're dealing with any kind of behavior change, we over-focus, I think, a little bit on how. Here's how you do it. Here's how you do it. Here's how you do it. Here's how you do wellness. Here's how you do your job. Here's how. And we don't focus enough on why. Why are we doing these things in the first place? What's the point of the exercise? And I think if we have a few more conversations about why and a few fewer conversations about how, things will work out pretty well. So what I want to do now is give you I hope it'll be very quick, this flow chart that I put together that shows, when to use rewards. Again, the idea here, let me just go back here for a second. The idea here isn't that external rewards are bad in all circumstances, not at all. But they're two very different classes of rewards. One is these if-then rewards, which are contingent rewards. They're generally not very good for complicated creative work, for routine work. They're not so bad for routine work. There also, though, are what I call now that rewards, as in that are unexpected and after the fact. So let's say Mari were to do something great inside of my company and I were the boss. I would say, hey, Mari, you did something great. Thank you. Okay? Unexpected after the fact. Hey, Mari, you did something great. Let me recognize you. Hey, Mari, you did something great. Let me give you a small bonus. Unexpected, non-contingent, after the fact. Because of that nature, they are not a form of control, and they can be useful and helpful, particularly as a form of giving feedback. So let me just walk you through very quickly here this thing when we think about this. So we look at this here, and we start here. Is the task mostly routine? You're trying to decide when to use rewards inside of your organization. Is the task mostly routine? Okay. Let's say that the task is routine. Okay. We're stuffing envelopes. Then you ask yourself, can you increase the task challenge or variety, make it less routine or connect it to a larger purpose? Okay. Let's say so let's try to make it less routine. What can we do to liven it up a little bit? Okay. If you can do that, that's going to take you down here. But let's say we can't do that. We say, no, that's pretty hard. This is a pretty boring routine task, okay? Then it's possible to use if-then rewards. If-then rewards are perfectly fine there. But you end up getting, let's say we're having people stuff envelopes, okay? We're having people stuff envelopes, and it's hard to change the challenge of variety. It's hard to connect it to some kind of transcendent purpose. And so we can use an if-then reward for stuffing envelopes. But it works a lot better if you, one, offer a rationale for why the task is necessary. So the reason we're stuffing envelopes is we have a big mailing coming up. The mailing is important, blah, 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 blah. Two, if you acknowledge that the task is boring. All right? And three, if you allow people to complete the task their own way. So if you could say, hey, listen, I need everybody to stuff envelopes. I want you to do this really fast, so I'm going to pay you per envelope. I know it's not that interesting, this task that you're doing. I know it's not that interesting. It's kind of boring. But let me tell you why we're doing it. We're doing it because it's essential to our next product line or something like that. And, we want you to stuff the envelopes. We're not going to tell you exactly how to do it. So we're going to pay you well. We even can pay you contingently. We're going to say it's not boring. We're going to give you a rationale for why, and we're going to allow you to do it the way you want to do it. Okay? That's if the task is routine. If it's not routine, then it's a different story. Then you need to concentrate on building a healthy, long-term motivational environment that pays people fairly and fosters autonomy, mastery, and purpose. You have to avoid if-then rewards in almost all circumstances and consider unexpected, non-contingent, now-that rewards. But remember that those unexpected, non-contingent, now-that rewards are more effective if they offer praise and feedback rather than things people can touch and spend. So you're better off unexpected after the fact saying, hey, recognize you for a great job, rather than, say, giving you a $200 gift card to Kohl's. And they provide useful information rather than an attempt to control. So if I'm generally giving you feedback rather than saying, hey, Mari, good job, as a prelude to softening you up for giving you a worse assignment. And so that's just, I hope it's somewhat simple. That's just the way of thinking about these kinds of rewards and when we should use them. And let me just sort of segue into the question and answer by talking about health. Now, again, the I think we can apply these kinds of notions to promoting health behavior as well. So if people have, for instance, if people have some amount of autonomy over what they do, when they do it, who they do it with, they might be more likely to engage. Now, obviously, in health behavior, it's not simply that, because you want an environment that encourages or that just sort of, in some ways, thoughtlessly allows people to follow positive habits. But if you give people some amount, that might be something as mundane as saying everybody needs to run, jog. When in fact, a lot of people don't want to do that. There might be some other kind of aerobic exercise that they could do. So I think that there are ways for people to autonomously choose the sorts of things that they want to do for healthy behavior, and in particular the way they want to do them. Second, mastery. I think that making progress is one way that habits get established. That when people have feedback on how they're doing, they engage in a task more significantly. And you see this a little bit in all of these apps that have come out for, say, measuring running and giving people, you can just monitor everything you're doing. And especially if you share that, it ends up being fairly motivating because you have a sense of context. So if you look at some of these iPhone and Android apps for people who run, or even the Nike Plus system, that is, having information on your performance, getting feedback, and seeing it in context of others can be actually very motivating. It's a form of information. It's a form of feedback. And finally, purpose. And here, two of the scholars who I write about in the book a lot, Edward Deasy and Richard Ryan, have done a little bit of research in this regard too. And essentially, purpose matters, especially in healthy behavior. Purpose matters. It's not the only thing. I don't want to oversell it. But it matters a lot, and sometimes it's a missing piece. So why you decide to engage in healthy behavior can be extraordinarily important. So let's take something like weight loss. Let's say that, I actually have a college reunion coming up in, how long? 3.5, 4 months, basically 4 months from now. I have a college reunion coming up. Now, let's say that I wanted to lose weight for my college reunion. It's like, oh, I got all these old friends, and I don't want to seem like a fat slob when I get there. So I'm going to lose 15 pounds. Okay, I'm going to lose 15 pounds in order so people at my college reunion don't think that I'm a fat slob. If that's my motivation, I'm probably going to hit it. Okay, I think there's a pretty good chance I'll lose my 15 pounds. But I think there's very little chance that I'll keep those 15 pounds off in an enduring way. All right, I'm probably going to be, breaking into the bag of Doritos as I drive away. That reason for healthy behavior can lead to ephemeral results. But if I say, hey, I want to lose weight because I'm worried about my health and I want to be here for my kids. I want to feel a greater sense of well-being. I want to enjoy my family life. If I do it for these kinds of intrinsic reasons, a lot of times and that's my purpose. The progress is slower in the short term, but more enduring in the long term. So let me just wrap up, and then we'll take some questions here. The key point here is that we've oversold carrots and sticks as motivators in a lot of different realms. They're good for some tasks, good for some things, but for a lot of things, they're just not the right approach. And what works better, even though it's much, 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 much harder, especially in the workplace, is paying people enough and then giving them a sense of autonomy and self-direction, putting them in positions where they make progress so they can achieve mastery, and allowing them to see how what they do each day contributes to a larger whole, and helping them understand why they're doing something, not only how they're doing it. And I think that the scientists who've done this research have really done something heroic and given us a new way to understand ourselves and a new way to build better lives. And I think that when we tease this out in the questions, I think there are some interesting extensions of this into the world of healthy behavior.
All right, Dan, thanks for that great commentary. So it's really exciting to hear about some of the different science that's gone into your research. And Kelly, I'm not seeing any questions showing here. Do we have any questions? Because we'd love to get got a lot of people out there with a lot of different experience and viewpoints, and we'd love to get some questions in here.
Yep, and generally how it works is everyone's a little shy, and then as soon as we get one or two questions, we get about 52 questions. So don't be shy. And Mari, if you have a question, maybe that'll break the ice.
Right. We'll start with, I've got a whole bunch of questions here because I've been thinking about this for a while and have had lots of time to, having been through this book a couple of times myself. So, Dan, the thing that I think from my work in the field of health promotion and working directly with clients on a regular basis goes to this whole carrot stick idea.
Yeah.
And, we do a lot in the field of health promotion with carrots and sticks. We have all kinds of ways that we reward really short-term activities. So a health risk assessment is a classic example in the field of health promotion. We pay people to take these, $50, $100, whatever it might be, so that we can collect data that we use as a baseline. And we view it as an awareness event, so people become aware of their health, hopefully as a result of this, but it doesn't change their behavior long term usually. And yet that's, one way in which we, as an example, we use that as a carrot to get what we want, which is the data. And more often now what we're finding is that employers are moving with their wellness program design to longer term rewards that would be around tied perhaps to their contributions for their benefits, their employee benefits, such as their health insurance. And
Right.
you might have to, get through 3 or 4 gates throughout a period of time, such as a year, instead of just do this one event type of thing. And that's tying it a little bit more to longer term behavior, but it still, is a stick.
Yeah, a little bit, and it's not necessarily. I mean, I'd be curious to see I like to see all the results of that. If you look at the health assessment, someone doing a health assessment. I mean, that's if you analogize from the world of actual work. That's a fairly routine thing. You got to show up,
Right.
and paying people $50 to show up isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world. Now, the danger you face, with something like that is that if you expect them to show up again, you better have another $50. That you basically guarantee that no one is ever showing up to do that for free. And so it has a cost beyond the dollar figure at the moment that you dole it out. On these kind of on these sort of gates you have to pass through. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'd be curious to see. My view on all these things is let's do what works and not do what doesn't work. And so if that thing actually if that works, I don't know. Maybe in certain realms it can be. It's a good idea. My concern with that is that you're basically encouraging compliant behavior, and you're using fear as a motivator in a way. I don't want to get my benefits cut. I don't want to have my health care costs go up, and that is often not the best motivator for long-term behavior. I wonder whether you get whether that kind of system would create some amount of cheating, of people basically coming up with ways to say, hey, I passed, faking out that they passed through that gate rather than really doing it. So I think that's a really curious thing. The other thing that makes this even more difficult, here's the thing. Health behavior is so much more difficult than work behavior. Because, I mean, it really is. Because I'm obviously preaching to the saved here. You already know this, but I'm just thinking about it from myself. Is that, at health behavior, you're going up against some pretty, you're going up against 50,000 years roughly of evolution here. Okay, and if you just think about something like weight loss or weight in general. We have brains that evolved when calories were scarce. So we're trained to basically get calories because calories used to be scarce. Well, now calories are abundant, and so but our brains haven't evolved, to the next level of a world of abundant calories, and so as a result, you're dealing with basically these evolutionary urges to store fat. And that's a very powerful force, and so one of the things I think obviously matters in health behavior is environment, is context. And you see this right now. It's like, so get rid of vending machines with unhealthy food and put in fruit and vegetables. Space things out so that people actually have to walk places, so they have to move in the course of their ordinary day. But there are large systemic problems, not only inside of firms, but in general, that are leading to unhealthy behavior. You think about the incredible reliance we have on automobiles and the lack of just physical activity that people get in an ordinary day. If you think about the abundance of high-calorie food that we have, and especially in lower socioeconomic areas, the lack of high-quality food. And so you're dealing with some big environmental factors. You're dealing with biological forces. And so it's not like there's going to be an easy fix for this problem. But, and I guess that's my main point, is that, a lot of times we're looking for kind of silver bullets. We're looking for saying, hey, what's the one solution we can have to encourage this? And we think that it's simply getting those carrot and stick motivators right. And that's just not the case. It's a far more difficult, far more complex problem. You see this, I sort of shake my head and wonder sometimes. You look at some of these things, there's certain kinds of wellness programs that I remember encountering inside of companies. They basically do this. Every time you go to the gym, you get a point or you get some points. And at the end of a certain time period, you can trade in those points for, something out of a catalog, okay, a gift or something like that. All right, and it's like, if you have these points, that's going to motivate people. And I'm thinking, like, what, staying alive is not sufficient motivation for exercising, and that people are going to be more motivated by the chance to get a plush toy than they will about staying alive. And so it's a really complicated problem, and I think it's a mix of things. It's a mix of recalibrating rethinking what it is that leads to enduring motivation, but also in this case, it's also thinking about the powerful effect that the environment plays, that we're not carrying out our behaviors in a vacuum. We're carrying them out in a world that is where we're relying on cars, where fast food is available everywhere, and also where people are stressed and busy and all this sort of thing.
Well, I think, given that most of our audience is, in the situation of working in worksites, health promotion in organizations, and recognize the importance of being able to change the environment and create an environment where the default behavior is the healthy behavior.
Yeah.
And that's the real key to what we do. But let's just go to your point about autonomy. And I think you're acknowledging how difficult this is. It's one of the things that challenges those of us who, are trying to come up with creative programming and creative approaches. And, we pray every time we put one of these programs out that it's going to work and we're going to get the success that we want. But to the autonomy point, if we really believe, and there are many of us that in our hearts would really love to be able to say that and believe that, intrinsically everybody wants to live a longer life. That, of course, we shouldn't have to reward people because you're right. I want to be there to see my kids graduate from high school and college and have babies and see their kids graduate. And but if that was the case, then we wouldn't necessarily have the health epidemics that we have going on in this country with, the obesity and diabetes and some of these other chronic diseases. So that apparently isn't working. Just leaving it up to people's, own self-control to be in compliance around, those kinds of things. So it's a dilemma that I have no idea how to solve and would love, your thoughts on. So how do we get people to be engaged, to be self-directing and self-responsible? Because it just doesn't seem to be working.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it's really, really, really hard. And I think a lot of it has to do with, if you look at some of the research in behavioral economics, there's a whole theory that says, this is actually a bigger problem than, it's not only health. It's things like, you ask people, do you want to have a comfortable retirement? Do you want to retire and have money available for your retirement? And everyone says, of course. And then you ask them, like, well, what are you doing to save for retirement? And they say nothing. So it's like, well, that's irrational. Why aren't people rational? We have a bias toward doing things for I mean, it's wired into our brain, doing things for short-term pleasure and satisfaction rather than postponing that kind of gratification over the long haul. And you see it in a whole, you see it in a whole variety of things. And I think that you hit on one of the, I'll give you one idea on autonomy and one idea on the other one. I think that you hit on what was perhaps the most powerful idea, and it's an environmental idea, and you used the word, which is essentially changing the default. There is a lot of inertia in people's behavior. And you see it in retirement savings, for instance. Let's take 401ks. For a long time, people would go to, you work in a company, they say, here's our 401k plan, do you want to be in or not? And, a lot of people went into it, but other people didn't. And then they ended up losing all these kinds of, the ability to save and get matched and all these things over years and years and years and years. I mean, the consequences were often dire. So what can you do? You can educate people about financial responsibility. You can give them charts to show how much money they could have lost. You can say, anybody who doesn't sign up has to, stay an extra hour at work, But what you can also do is this, as you're suggesting, you can change the default. You can say, here's how it works at this company. You're automatically enrolled in our 401k plan unless you opt out. And so when companies started doing that, and it's now actually part of the federal law, the number of people saving for retirement shot up. And so I think that there are probably some options like that in health where you change the default. And and I think that that's really where a lot of the opportunities are. Now, I do think there is a role, though, for autonomy here. And you see a little bit of this in some of the research on some of the research, not from the social psychology side of the field of psychology, but from the sort of clinical and counseling side, which is something called motivational interviewing, which is essentially a therapeutic technique that gets people to begin to announce their own reasons for doing something, for encouraging behavior, for changing their behavior. So a motivational interviewing question would be something like this. So, Maury, you say you want to eat better. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important is that to you to eat better? And let's say you say, "Oh, Dan, it's an 8." And I say to you in response to that, "Oh, really? It's an 8. Why isn't it lower?" Okay, kind of a surprising question. Why isn't it lower? And you say, well, wait a second, and then you begin sort of articulating the reasons why it's important to you. You begin to come up with your own autonomous reasons for engaging in this behavior. And if those are acted out in the right kinds of contexts and the right kinds of environments, that can be pretty important. Then at the same time, if people are getting feedback on how they're doing, that can be helpful. That is, all of us have habits. And, it's possible I think that there's something to be said for coming up with new environments and new defaults to help people establish these kinds of healthy habits. And I think one way to do that is to come up with, how do you give people feedback on whether they're making progress on healthy behavior? How do you recognize them for doing these kinds of things? And then I also think there's a role for purpose. I think that people need to think of making the salience of why a little bit higher. That said, it's really, really, really hard. And if you put people, the most autonomous, mastery-oriented, purpose-driven people, in an environment where they can't make those kinds of choices, it's not going to work.
I understand. Yeah, it is hard and that's one of the challenges that so many of us face.
What's going on out there in the world of changing the default? I think there's a lot of juice in that. I've just seen it in other kinds of. You see it in something like organ donation, where you register for. Here in Washington D.C. they changed it. So it used to be that I think they changed it. I just renewed my driver's license, where they say. Actually, I don't think they changed it yet. You go to renew. You go to get a driver's license. I live in Washington D.C. You go to get a driver's license, and a lot of times when you go to get your driver's license, they'll say, "Do you want to be an organ donor?" And people either say yes or no. But a lot of people say no. And in European countries, it's typically saying they do this. They say, "Here's your driver's license. We've signed you up to be an organ donor. Do you want to opt out?" And as a result, they get far greater. There's still autonomy there. You have a choice, but by changing the default, you encourage this kind of behavior. I just think there's a lot of juice in that kind of approach. Again, but it's not on its own going to be transformative.
So we'd still like to have some questions from some of the many professionals that we have joining us on the call today, and we don't want anybody to be shy because we know you're not. So let's have a couple more questions because we're coming up near the amount of time that we have allocated for today.
Can you see them out there? Because I see quite a few.
No, I'm not seeing them, Kelly, so I'm going to need to have you help me and have you read a couple of them.
All right, I'll start reading them. Lynn wants to know if there's a difference between motivating kids and adults.
Yeah, I mean, it's the answer is like in all things, yes and no. I think that you can't. It's harder to have a conversation about the transcendent purpose of life and how you're going to make a contribution to the world with an 8-year-old. It's an easier conversation to have with a 38-year-old. But I do think that a lot of these kinds of practices, I think that kids are pretty autonomous and pretty self-directed early on. But I think that people have learn a whole set of negative behaviors that make them more compliant and passive and inert. And I think the more we encourage these things, this approach of self-direction among kids, of understanding the nature of mastery and how delightful it is to get better at something and how hard you have to work to get better at something, seeing how what they do fits in, understanding the why of things, I think we can begin to develop these kinds of things in kids, and then we don't have to teach them to adults. One of the things that happens in the workplace is that people have learned a lot of passive and compliant behaviors. And then we say, wait a second, these people aren't very creative. Well, I want to be creative. I'm going to give you autonomy now. And it doesn't work in that kind of flip a switch way. You have to unlearn a lot of behavior. And I think that the way to avoid adults unlearning behavior is for kids not to learn that behavior in the first place.
All right, what else do we have there, Kelly?
Do we have more questions?
Oh, I'm sorry. That was my... Can you hear me now?
That was your cue.
Yeah, I have a little audio thing here. But anyways, Leslie wants to know, she says, many aspects of health promotion involve avoiding versus doing tasks, like don't eat fat, don't smoke, and she wants to know how that fits into the flow chart.
No, it's a really good question. I don't know. I don't know. It's a great question. I mean, what do you see, Mari? I mean, working in this every day. I mean, is there a difference that you've seen in motivating, avoiding and active behavior?
Well, that's a very interesting question because, fundamentally what we're trying to get people to do is to, in essence, rewire their brains to change the behavior. Take smokers as an example. Smokers is a classic example of behavior that's a learned behavior. We're not born smoking, and we practice it a lot. So we practice it, as smokers, they practice many, many times a day.
Right.
And getting them to change that behavior requires, in essence, the rewiring of their brain. And if you think about any behavior change that we're doing, that's really what we're doing, is we're having to consciously begin to think about what it is that we're supposed to be doing as the alternative behavior. Take your watch off your left hand and put it on your right hand if you don't believe me.
Right.
That's a learned behavior that is encoded in your brain.
Yep.
So until we can help people, and it's not so much thinking about the avoiding versus the doing, I think, as much as it is about really thinking about that we're asking them to really rewire the synapses around the things they've learned to do.
Yeah. I think that makes, and I think that's a very, as you're suggesting, that's a tall order. My guess is that avoidance types of things might, and this is totally a guess because I don't, I think it's a terrific question and it's really making me wonder because I don't know I'm not sure what the answer is, and it's a fascinating way to look at it. I'd be really curious to see whether there's research out there. But my hunch is that avoidance behavior can be maybe more susceptible to in the environment. So let's say, don't eat fatty foods, And maybe that's something like, you know, I don't know, you know, again, I keep going back to the vending machine example, but maybe that means inside of a company, don't have fatty food for sale, all right? In the company cafeteria, don't have crappy food, have only healthy food there. And that's a good way in the environment to have people avoid that kind of, have that kind of thing. You know, how about, you know, don't drive everywhere. Well, maybe there's a way to, maybe you don't, I have no idea, you know, you shrink the size of parking lots or something like that. And so I think that the avoiding might be more susceptible to the environmental things.
Yeah, it's a really very good question, so thanks for asking that one. Have we got a couple more questions here because we're almost out of time, and I want us to make sure that we address a few questions.
Okay. Laura asks, why do you think if the research so clearly indicates the carrot and stick approach doesn't work, why do we keep applying it in practice, whether it's health promotion or business?
Yeah, that's another great question. I think there are a lot of reasons, particularly in business. First is that it has worked in the past. That there is again, one of the big changes is what people actually do for a living. Not too long ago in this country, most people did relatively routine things as their job. They were turning the same screw the same way on an assembly line. You know, they were doing relatively routine white-collar work. And so those kinds of motivators work pretty well there. What's happened is that over the last decades or so, the nature of work has changed, and yet the motivational mechanisms haven't changed with it. So I think that's one factor. Another factor, as I mentioned before, is that they work in the short term. And so a lot of managers get faked out. So let's say that I want to come up with a new product idea, or I want my team to be innovative. I say $5,000 to whoever comes up with a great idea. And what will happen is people will work. You'll get activity. Now, the science is pretty clear. You're not going to get much breakthrough thinking under that kind of situation. But you'll get activity. People will scurry around. They'll work late. And I think that fakes out managers quite a bit. I think that's a reason. I think inertia is another reason. It's what we've always done. So, again, this is what we're up against in health promotion, too. If I do something, if I behave a certain way on Wednesday, the odds are very good I'm going to behave that way on Thursday. And the other thing I think is just more pernicious is that these kinds of carrot and stick motivators for managers, they're easy, okay? It's very easy for me to say, hey, $5,000 to whoever comes up with a great idea. It's very difficult for me to say, I mean, it's harder work for me to say, what's the appropriate level of autonomy for Maury? How can I put Kelly in a position where she's making progress each day? How do I infuse the workplace with a sense of purpose? How do I figure out what makes Jose tick so I can put him in a position where he's maximally effective? That's very difficult. And so all those things together, the sense of, you know, inertia, the fact that we've always relied on them, the fact that they're easy, the fact that they're short-term, makes them very pernicious, very, very hard to scrub away.
I think that's a fabulous response to why we keep doing what we do. And,
yeah, and I think it's true for health, too, yeah.
It's very true. So I think that would probably be a great place for us to wrap it up for today. I'd like to thank everyone who took the time this afternoon to join us. And, Dan, this was just a fabulous conversation. As always, I was delighted to have you join us. I know it took months in the planning to get this time set aside. And I would encourage everyone to visit Dan's website, danpink.com. Follow him on Twitter. He's got great blogs, great videos, lots of fun stuff that's very thought-provoking and that I think you might find to be really interesting. So, Dan, thanks again for your time, and thanks, everybody, for joining us. Those of you, Kelly, you want to tell us about CEU units for anybody who needs those?
Sure. Anyone that's taking the course today for CEUs, RD, CHES, or ACSM, can purchase those units at healthpromotionlive.com. In about an hour from now, you'll be sent a follow-up email. It will have the link, and it will have a discount code good for 25% off.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
All right. Thanks, you guys.
Thank you.